You can go ahead now, Ruth.
Okay, so good morning and welcome to the Indigenous Scholars Speaker Series. My name is Ruth Shedd. I am a Cree member of Peguis First Nation. I'm the Director of Partnerships and Communications for the Office of the Vice President Indigenous at the University of Manitoba. And I'm very fortunate to work with an incredible team who has made this year's Indigenous Scholar Speaker Series possible. Sarah Olson coordinated this year's lineup. Nikita Longman looks after the communications and promotions for the series. And Ange Williams is supporting the virtual delivery of today's talk. And so I want to begin today by acknowledging our relations. I honor our dependence on and our responsibility to protect the land and the water. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. The water that we drink here in the city of Winnipeg comes from Shoal Lake 40, and the electricity that we're using to host today's session comes from Treaty 5 territory. Today, I'm also thinking about everyone who has been affected by COVID-19, and I'm keeping those who are fighting the virus and those who have lost loved ones in my mind, heart, and prayers. So the Indigenous Scholar Speaker Series launched in 2018. The talks highlight research and expertise of Indigenous scholars at the University of Manitoba. Indigenous scholars produce and share research and curriculum that is shaping the landscape and learning at the university. Beyond campus, their work is transforming the lives of Indigenous and all peoples and communities. Today, there will be time for questions and answers at the end of the session. So if you have a question for the speaker, you can use the chat function on Zoom or the comment section on Facebook. Both are being monitored. If you are on Zoom, please be sure to remain muted. And now I'm honored to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Michael Yellowbird. Dr. Yellowbird is a professor and dean of the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba. He is a citizen of 3 affiliated tribes, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara. He is the author of several scholarly articles. He's co-edited books and is the co-author of 2 books, Sanish Arikara, Ethnobotany, 2020, and Decolonizing Holistic Pathways Towards Integrative Healing in Social Work, 2021. His research focuses the effects of colonization, methods of decolonization, ancestral health, mindful decolonization, and the cultural significance of res dogs. Today, his talk is called Molecular Decolonization, Healing Through Traditional Indigenous Practices. So I will pass the floor over to you, Dr. Yellowbird.
Thank you, Ruth. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you everyone for attending this session. I'm gonna, Ruth, how long do I have?
So generally, you can present for 30 to 40 minutes and then we'll time for questions.
Okay.
Whatever you prefer, yeah. Okay.
So I've got a lot of slides, so I'm not gonna do all my slides today. So what I wanna do is just kind of get you to some of the key slides that I want to show today. And can you see that? Is it up on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me just get started on slideshow here. So I'm going to kind of move through this fairly quickly, understanding that you're scholars and you're going to get it the first time through. So this particular presentation I've done a number of times, and I really frame in a way to talk about the work that I do and what's important, I think, in the work that I've been trying to do. So I call it neurodecolonization and the medicine wheel. I think of the work that I'm doing is a kind of a holistic approach to Indigenous wellness. So let's see here, sorry. I don't know why this thing is, okay. So really what I want to talk a little bit about today, I'm not going to get real deep into this, is some of my work around neurodecolonization. The idea of neurodecolonization is the brain, right? So the neurons, it's a lot like neuropsychology, neuroeconomics, and some of these other fields that have incorporated how the brain works. when people are engaged in particular kinds of activities, that what part of the brain functions, what part of the brain gets quiet, and so on. So neurodecolonization is my idea of marrying neuroscience with decolonization. And I'm not a neuroscientist, but I've spent a lot of time looking at neuroscience, a number of different neurosciences, and generally more at cultural neuroscience. I've kind of really become fascinated with some of the research in that area. So neurodecolonization is like, how can we decolonize from different kinds of trauma, different kinds of lifestyle habits that are not habits that that I'll talk about in just a minute. So when I look at it, I think about the experiences and perceptions of trauma of Indigenous people, and most people change the brain structure and the function, something known as neuroplasticity that probably many of you have heard of or know a lot about. I wonder how it changes the environment that we live in, changes or silences our gene expression, and leading to an epigenetic expression. What kinds of things are happening in the brain? How does trauma, our perceptions, and those kinds of things change brain waves and specialized brain cells such as mirror neurons that we connect with other people with? How about the neurotransmitters and modulators, and also like what happens to our gut and our gut health when we're faced with trauma or chronic stress or large changes. So what I've tried to do with this talk is, what I'm trying to do with it is really kind of moving it toward, like, what is my major idea? The major idea I have is that I know we can use Indigenous and Western knowledge and science to recover the health and well-being of Indigenous people. There's a formula that can help us live longer, healthier, happy, more fulfilling lives. And what I want to do with my work is give people a reason to care, right? So generally I ask audiences like, how many of you have experienced the premature death of a loved one by an illness that you know is preventable? Then generally people raise their hands. And how about yourself? Maybe you experienced a disease or an illness that you knew was preventable. Right? How about how many of you are concerned and frustrated about the disproportionate illness that you see in our communities? We can look at that now in terms of COVID-19, where I come from, where there's a lot of people being affected in my reservation community by COVID-19 infections and a number of deaths in my small community. The third thing is, what are familiar concepts? Well, in this talk, I want to talk about ancestral health. What does that mean? How does decolonization fit into that? From evolutionary theory, there's the evolutionary trap, they say, or mismatch theory. How are we as Indigenous people doing in this industrialized first world context, right? Why do we end up with so many diseases and illnesses, whether they're mental health or physical health, right? Chronic disorders, reduced life expectancy, loss of functional movement and limitations we have, and there are all these different kinds of things to think about. And the other thing is like, what is traditional lifestyle look at? And so I've got these 4 pieces from a TED Talk. How do you make your idea worth sharing? And I think look at the research and also look at the knowledge that exists. So I want to just talk a little bit about the medicine wheel today and how I think it's very critical to helping us decolonize ourselves and guide us toward, personal, I get community justice, but this should be health, right? And what can we learn from our ancestors? Why they were correct in the way that they lived, how they practiced healing and created community and so on, including how living like a Westerner is very hazardous to our health. I share some terms, and I apologize because I have to move kind of quickly through this. So I'm not going to get a chance to elaborate on all the terms and that sort of thing. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the science and traditional knowledge regarding cognitive resilience and trauma and so on. A little bit of neuroscience, talk a bit about adaptive stress, or what's called now hormesis, right? How we mild bioenergetic stress that folks are talking a lot about now today when we start talking about healthy aging. And also just very briefly touch on genetic variants if I get a chance, and how certain kinds of things, expression of certain kinds of genes can prime us for trauma and short circuit our wellness and so on. It's interesting too, I've found, I've done my own DNA analysis, and I've had it analyzed a few times, and it's really interesting coming back. So as I look at the what I picked up from my mother and father, so I'm well aware of that, and it's really fascinating. Neurodecolonization, in this sense, these are my two daughters at the bottom. The idea of, how do we can engage in this evolutionary mind-body practices to liberate ourselves from the effects of colonization, right? The incongruent, damaging beliefs and all these things that exist. Decolonization then is this meaningful and active resistance to the forces of colonization. Any of those pieces of colonization that subjugate or exploit our minds and bodies. And the idea is that in neurodecolonization is that in order for decolonization to work, it has to first occur in our minds. I try to pull it together with the medicine wheel, looking at the medicine wheel in terms of a holistic system that includes, an analysis of the brain, our genetic profile, our microbes that live, in and on us, and cellular and molecular systems, and how those are affected, as well as what kind of lifestyles did we live in the past, how are we living today, how about the communities, and how our relationship, we had with the environment really shaped us and who we are. I'll go through this quickly. This is the medicine wheel on Turtle Island. The first slide here is a medicine wheel in the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming, 10,000 years old. It's really fascinating. If you were to see the medicine wheel from up high, you would see that this is what it looks like from up high. I'm just going to get my laser pointer here. And if you can imagine, that the archaeological work that's been done here has found evidence of a lot of activity here, thousands of years ago, where tribes or different peoples would come here and they would spend time at the medicine wheel. So it was kind of like an ancient sort of crossroads for people, a spiritual crossroads for people. Today, people still go to the medicine wheel there in the Bighorn Mountains, and they leave different kinds of gifts, things like medicine wheels, and prayer offerings, and prayer flags. And I'm always amazed when I look at this, when people come and they leave their prayer flags, how it relates a lot to Tibetan Buddhist prayer flags that are put up, in terms of sending prayers out to the world, that, the things that we do have and the actions that we take have a greater connection to the world around us. Just like the body has that kind of system where, it's not like Western medicine. I went to see the doctor the other day, and I had a checkup, and I asked him some questions, and the doctor knew absolutely nothing about nutrition or nothing about some of the other questions I had, and it doesn't surprise me because I've worked with a lot of doctors before, and it's not really holistic. They specialize in one particular area, but I generally recommend to the doctors I visit a lot of research. I say, well, if you're interested in this, here's some things you can read that are on PubMed that are, that I think you'd be interested in, that you could probably tell your patients, right? Anyway, the point is that, I think of it in terms of holistic, and these flags, in a sense, are a way that shows that Indigenous people have a connection to something much larger than themselves and their tribes, or the whole universe, and the connections to that. So this is a Sundance down in my part of the country, where people have put the flags up in the tree of life, and of course the prayers that go out. In North Dakota, you can find some people have even built replicas of the medicine wheel in Wyoming. This is Valley City, North Dakota. The Haskell Indian Nations University, which was once a residential school in Lawrence, Kansas, which is now a university. This would have been prohibited, 50 years ago. But the students and the faculty got together and made this medicine wheel. And as you can see, there's different symbolic messages here or symbols. So this is a water bird from the southern tribes, who are folks that in the Native American church, it's part of one of their religious beliefs. Within a circle here, you see all these people, cars parked on the outside, and all the people going in here, either to pray or maybe they're getting a tour, but talking about, exactly what, what I've been trying to convey. The medicine wheel is, this has all this representation of different kinds of things. Judicula rock is very interesting because it's a rock that's been around for quite some time. A few years back, I was invited to Kalawee, North Carolina, northern or eastern Cherokee country, and talked to the elders, and they took me out to this rock and they showed me the rock, and then they talked about how old the rock was, and it really wasn't a Cherokee, thing, but this was a rock. There were many tribes came by and left their marks, their inscriptions in it. So when you look at the inscriptions in the rock, you see all these different kinds of symbols and look what looks like people. And one that I see here is this this kind of one that looks like a sci-fi sort of being here with that looks like suction cups, but also holding the hand of someone smaller, right, a child or whatever. So this person or being or whatever it is taking this road, and along the road, there's stops in the road, running into different kinds of things, and then and this is kind of explained to me by the elders. Stops along the way until this goes up, up into who knows where, up into to the cosmos or whatever, and then you see all different kinds of beings here. So what I was told, by the people that study this, and as well as the elders, is that all the tribes were leaving their symbols, and they were meeting one another all across Turtle Island, right? So in 10,000 years ago, you had the medicine wheel in Wyoming. Here you have Judicula rock on the eastern seaboard of Turtle Island. And then if you turn your attention here, so then you see a symbol of, it looks like a turtle in a medicine wheel. So again, a lot of circles and this kind of thing in this connection here. So it's easy to kind of see how people refer to these lands as Turtle Island. Again, some more circles. This looks a lot like the medicine wheel in Montana. More circles, and again, different carvings and symbols. The Mojave Desert, you see a sun sign, which really, if you took those lines there and put them inside of the circle, it would be the inverted medicine wheel. This is my own reservation back at Fort Berthold, the 3 affiliated tribes, where there's a large medicine wheel on the side of this hill, kind of the Badlands looking area here, where young people back in the 90s, I was one of those young people back then that helped construct this medicine wheel after a Sundance ceremony. Here you see some more out in the desert. See the medicine wheels here. These are, some of these are thousands of years old, hundreds of years old. Which leads us then to more of my talk. Knowing that our people, or indigenous people, were conceptualizing their world in terms of a circle and bringing these things together, I think is really sort of provides affirmation for those of us who look at the medicine wheel and say, the mind and the body are not separate. And the mind and the body and the feelings and the spirit of people, are not separate. The emotions are not separate, and all these other things. So what I've done with this particular symbol is I've said, well, there's the mind part, and what I've been looking at a lot now is, what happens to the brain in terms of the neurogenesis, neuroplasticity, a lot of other things. I'm just kind of using those. The body, I've become not only fascinated with the type of exercise and movement science, but I've also become very, very fascinated with the microbiome science and what that looks like around the world when people's microbiome is sequenced. When we see hunter-gatherers what do their bacteria look like compared to people here? If you look at indigenous people in an urban area like Winnipeg, is their microbiome going to be different than people that live, way out in the woods and don't eat, some of these fast foods and those kinds of things? And the answer is yes, probably yes, right? There's some very big differences between people in the rainforest that live a very traditional lifestyle. They're in the dirt and so on, and don't have the chronic diseases that we have. And when you compare them to, I saw a study where they compared them to native people. I think it's in Oklahoma, a couple of cities in Oklahoma, very vastly different microbiome. And of course, the people in the rainforest didn't have the heart disease. They didn't have the depression. They didn't have the cancers. They didn't have all the diabetes and chronic diseases that native people did living in the urban area. The next part of the medicine wheel then is the part of the contemplative practices that we engage in. Also, then the final part of the medicine wheel is the genetic part of it. So I don't separate these are all together. So I think, as I said earlier, the culture, the experiences, and the perceptions, all of these things affect the plasticity of our brain, actually the plasticity of our genes and our cells. Everything, isn't transfixed, but it can, can be changed by our experiences. So what I'm looking at in my research and looking at my work is how do we heal, transform from the diseases of colonization, right? And I think the big thing is, again, as I said, is rediscovery of our ancestral knowledge and practices. And to me, that means that the plasticity of the brain, our human microbiome, changes when we change our diet, changes when we reduce stress, changes when we fast, and all those different kinds of things I'll talk about. They shift. So does our genetic expression. I've been really looking at a lot of interesting videos by people who do a lot of research around genetics, and it's really interesting how people now are talking about not only just using things like exercise and better sleep and those kinds of things to change our genetic expression, but there's a whole world going on where people are beginning to experiment with different kinds of pharmaceuticals to change or turn off genetic expression to delay aging and that sort of thing. But we don't have to do that. We have some of that stuff right available to us right here and now. So anyway, the idea is to return to these traditional practices. Movement. We would never guess that sleep is a traditional thing, but it is. When you look at hunter-gatherer populations, how well they sleep versus how well we sleep. Laughter, and why that's critical. Collectivism, being together in a group. Fasting, why that's so critical, and how does that show up in our genetic profiles. Our contemplative practices that we used to do, and what does that do to the brain, and so on, and adaptive stress and all these different kinds of things. So I'm not going to get a chance to talk about all those, but I want to kind of get us to the meat of the talk. So colonization that I've been talking about, simply this idea of this invasion and unwelcome intrusion. And I like to use diabetes. I could probably use COVID-19, but I like to use diabetes, where an unwelcome intrusion from people, Europeans who came with different kinds of foods, or people that manufacture foods, like the food industry, invade us, with these ideas that we have to have this food, this fast food. When we eat the fast food, we have this toxic and harmful interaction with the fast food. An infection sets in, or for our purposes, diabetes sets in. Our pancreas, our system gets overwhelmed, and either we die from it or we get sick, right? So when we move to colonization, then when we actually become colonized and we can survive the diabetes that we have, it's because we're taking insulin, right? And so the idea is that we don't change our life. We remain colonized in that sense by taking the insulin, right? When we know now today that diabetes is almost fully reversible for almost everyone. So it's interesting. So decolonization is about this. stripping away of these, the cleansing period where we're stripping away harmful, invasive thoughts and practices, beliefs, and so on that have been imposed by colonizing processes, structures. And then the next period is the Renaissance period, where this is happening a lot now too with people, where there's a restoration of cultural practices, thinking, beliefs, and values that were taken away or abandoned during the time of colonization, but they're relevant and necessary for our well-being today. Finally, the period of enlightenment of decolonization is this. How can we give birth to new ideas in our current context, right? New thinking. How about the use of new technologies like we're using now, Zoom? How can we use that to contribute to the empowerment and the well-being of Indigenous people? So those are the 3 parts of decolonization, right? And I try to use, I'll show you my model here in just a second. But also the idea then up here, we know that when we look at most people in Western society, most of us are mismatched to the environment, right? We had evolved traits in the past where we may have like a gene called FTO, where we were more likely, significantly likely to pack on fat, right? To pack on weight. And that whole idea of that particular gene was to keep us alive during the next famine. So that's what we continue to do, right? So I'll move on here. Let me go to this first part of the brain here, decolonizing the mind. And I've got, this is just a small part of the work that I've done so far. I've done a lot more with this, but I try to use this part of the presentation just to kind of show you how traditional healing contemplative practices really can change the brain structure and function, and can really help in the genesis or the growth of new neurons and heal. So the 12 mindfulness practices that I've been looking at that can heal our emotions, reset our genetic expression, facilitate improved learning are these. Movement first, right? Running, dancing, singing, not necessarily so much movement, but children, adults were meant to move. We were all meant to move. In fact, that's one of the things that we do. Our movement has been colonized. Sleep, very, very critical. I didn't realize how much people were studying sleep until I started looking at it a few years ago to kind of look at all the sleep studies and how it's connected to circadian rhythms. The importance of laughter and humor and how there's genetic components to that. Collectivism, being in groups, also has a very powerful genetic component to that. Intermittent fasting, which has really become, it's just kind of really become popular in mainstream culture. When you look at Indigenous people, that kind of was a way of life, especially during this time of the year in the winter, where people had to make their food go a long way. So they ate less, what we call calorie restriction today. People were doing that a long time ago. Meditation, prayer, those kinds of things, and what it does to the brain and the body, and even to the molecular structure. The article that we wrote called Molecular Decolonization talk a little bit about telomeres in there, and about how telomeres at the end of the chromosome can be shortened by traumatic chronic stress, and how research has shown that we can have some of those gain backs, that gain of the telomere getting a little longer when we are engaged in things that are healthy for us. Adaptive stress, being in hot or very cold situations, and how they improve what are called heat shock proteins. I'll talk a little bit more about those. And of course, being outside. So I'm going to get past that. If we look at, just really briefly, I've been really looking at the movement science and evolutionary biology, and understand, that humans, we evolved to run and move, right? We didn't evolve to sit. And that's kind of been one of the major problems in Western society, is that we're very much a sitting society. I don't know about you, what you're all doing right now, but I'm at a standing desk. And the pandemic has actually been good for me because I'm a person who likes to move. So I'm in my garage and I've got my weight stack over here where I lift my weights. I got my treadmill right to my right side of me. And so in between meetings, I'll put up my stuff on my treadmill and I'll read, or I'll just run for 2 hard minutes and then I'll come back to working. So, to me, it's really been a boon for me. Persistence running is in our heritage. It's really been interesting to read that literature about how we ran down our food or how we had to go out and collect our food all the time and what implications that has for our health, and how we don't do that today. And what the result is today, we have many more cases of osteoporosis. We have weak bones, and bones are getting weaker, in children even earlier. So running and movement improves our physical fitness, mental health. There's so much research been done in that area. Improves the brain's working memory and processing speed, very critical. Also, the executive function of the brain, our ability to delay gratification, which is part of the executive function, avoid distraction, or more focused, and the improvement of cognitive flexibility to move from one cognitive task to the next and sort of have a greater level of emotional regulation. I didn't know a lot about the brain when I was looking at the different factors in the brain. Right? I've never taken any courses in neuroscience. I've just learned from picking up books in neuroscience, and then I have colleagues who are neuroscientists that I, talk with at different times. So I learned about, this brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is people have written about. It's like miracle grow for the brain. The more BDNF rises you have in your brain, the more neurogenesis that occurs. So we know that, there's a number of studies that have shown that people who exercise and run have a burst of neuronal growth in their brains, and they, develop what sometimes is called cognitive reserve, a lot more brain cells. And BDNF is responsible for that. So when you run, your levels of BDNF go up, right? So I'm not a neuroscientist, so I always say, how do I remember this when I was first learning it? So brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So I would run a lot. I run almost every day. And so I said to myself, BDNF reminds me of big darn native fella, right? So I would imagine as I was running, there was this big native guy in my brain pouring this BDNF on my brain. And as I ran, I was growing new neurons, right? So, and that's important. Some of the research I've looked at says that, that's why running is good for the treatment of Parkinson's disease as well as Alzheimer's, because as we grow more neurons, sometimes the brain can do a workaround some of those damaged areas. And that's part of the cognitive reserve. There's a lot of good studies that I've read regard to that. The LTP, the long-term potentiation, essentially the idea is that neurons that fire together when we run, and we breathe, if we pray when we run, if we sing when we run, do different kinds of things, those neurons, for all those activity, all those different actions we're taking are going to fire. The more we do it, they wire together and makes it stronger and stronger, so that we have this long-term sort of payoff from doing that kind of thing. The part that probably interested me the most more recently was that exercise, and I realize now probably why depression is one of the leading mood disorders among Indigenous people around the world, really. Exercise protects us from depression, right? By increasing the skeletal muscle kynurenine aminotransferase, right? CAT expression, which shifts away this kynurenine metabolism away from this neurotoxic KYN kynurenine to the production of kynuretic acid, right? So what we have are all the protective factors that we need in our body, and movement is one of them. And I think for Indigenous people, probably, I don't know if we've suffered more than most people because our movement has been colonized or not, but it certainly seems like there's a connection to how in terms of our health and wellness, and how much we're moving. So I call it like a movement deficit disorder. See it up here. Also, really important in this whole movement is also dancing, right? So it was interesting to me when I start looking at dancing and I start to find these studies about how when people dance and they sing, these levels of endocannabinoids, concentrations, go up and they improve people's moods and they reduce stress and reduce anxiety, enhance memory. So there you got movement again, right? So these studies are showing, you know, these increases in different endocannabinoids in these postmenopausal females. And dancing, you know, improves mood, and of course, and cycling also on endocannabinoids. So any kind of movement, you know, where you get your heart rate up and you're moving for a while begins to release these endocannabinoids, right? Endo meaning within the cannabinoid, of course, is like the natural opioid in the body. Right? So it's interesting too, where I was looking at this and I start looking at the singing and evolutionary aspects of singing, as well as the current science on singing, and start to find out that, wow, it really has a powerful effect on raising endocannabinoids in the brain. And people that like to sing, right? People that are from these local choirs. But when you start, you know, it's really fascinating. When you start looking at indigenous people, back historically speaking, you'll find out that when they were first encountered by whites or Europeans or whoever these folks were, they encountered them, they would find them that they were moving a lot. They were dancing a lot. They were celebrating and singing a lot, right? So, you know, they felt good, right? Because here we see that this endocannabinoids, you know, signal, you know, these novel signaling messengers, right? They improve mood, reduce stress and anxiety and so on, reduce pain. I like the idea that they enhance memory and protect the brain function. So when I think about Western science and everything I've read about Alzheimer's disease in particular, right? I say that, well, there's no cure for Alzheimer's. The only way we can get around Alzheimer's is we can, you know, come up with some kind of drug or pharmaceutical. But research now is starting to show that there are big differences between hunter-gatherer populations that move, that dance, that sing, and people in our community that end up with higher levels of Alzheimer's diagnoses, right? And that's been rising among indigenous people around the world. But yet, we haven't been using any of these natural, more traditional kinds of ways to kind of protect our brain. Laughter. Humor is in our genes. I come from a family that loves to laugh. We love to tell jokes. We love to pull pranks. We love to tease. It's very traditional in our tribes, where teasing is an accepted kind of practice, you know, smiling, any of those kinds of things. So some of this research I've looked at comes from Joan Chiao, who and other people who have looked at, you know, DNA differences in terms of people in their variants, their genetic variants, and, you know, why people would laugh more. You know, why would they laugh more, right? Why do they find things more amusing? And they've even identified a particular gene. It's called the serotonin transporter gene, the 5-HTTLPR. So if you see folks that, you know, smile and laugh easily, you know, chances are, you know, that they may have, you know, maybe one of these variants, or maybe two, right? If they're, you know, people that, my oldest brother was like that, laughing all the time, telling jokes all the time. Right? What we know about this is that, you know, from Chiao's study, is that people with the short alleles, you know, that have the, I call it the funny bone gene, right? Flourish in a positive environment where there's a lot of laughter, where there's a lot of teasing, a lot of smiling, a lot of, you know, joking and that sort of thing. While people with the long alleles, interestingly enough, these are people that are found, I don't have a copy of the chart in this particular presentation, but you'll see a lot of the longer alleles, people who are less, don't have the funny bone gene are more people from certain European countries. And they're very less sensitive to environmental conditions. They don't need humor, they don't need laughter, they don't need teasing. They probably do much better in a very serious, don't smile, this is a very serious kind of place to be environment, right? So there you've got a really interesting kind of clash of cultural, or clash of genes, maybe, let's say. So in Joan Chow's work, besides this particular gene being, related to humor and laughter, it's also related to collectivist cultures, right? So you would say, well, that's why when you look at collectivist cultures, they probably have a lot more joking and humor, and they clearly have more individuals that carry this particular gene, right? There's a higher frequency of these people in the cultures. Again, fascinating to me. A lot of implications when you think about that when you're working with Indigenous groups, right? Why don't people use humor and laughter when they're doing therapy, or when they're talking with people, or when people are in the bad mood, right? So laughing, of course, all these different kinds of things. Besides all of these things, it again raises the level of endocannabinoids in the brain, as well as it boosts BDNF, right? You're getting a lot of good laughter going on. Res dogs, right? Sleeping, again, very, very important. Again, I wasn't really clear about how important sleep was until I started looking at some of the studies around sleep, and start looking at hunter-gatherers, how they sleep versus how we sleep in this particular context, or this culture, right? How we don't sleep is really what I should say. So if we don't sleep enough, we disrupt our circadian rhythms. What's interesting about that, when you look at the research though, you'll find that hunter-gatherers have a very different kind of sleep pattern than we do, right? Here, people will tell you, you got to sleep 8 hours a night, to be the best you can be, and avoid Alzheimer's and all these other diseases. When you look at hunter-gatherer populations, there seems to be a greater level of frequency of where they sleep maybe for like 4 solid hours. They may get up for an hour or two, and then they may sleep in again for another 3 or 4 hours. So people are speculating why they do that, right? And part of the thing is that we've still got this evolutionary clock that goes off for danger at night, so we have to kind of wake up and sort of look around, right? And so, and again, this is all theoretical stuff, but I find it quite fascinating that people are telling us we have to sleep this many hours without recognizing the evolutionary history of people. They don't understand the evolutionary biological implications here. So the molecular clock that we have keeps us in sync with the sun, and essentially when that breaks down, we're at increased risk for all these diseases. What I was most fascinated in this work that I was coming across, that not only does our brain shrink when we don't sleep enough, but when we don't get into those deeper levels of sleep, then we get a higher level of gunk in the brain, right? In terms of things like amyloid proteins, which are our hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. Look, the research talks about how when we sleep enough, the brain has a way of cleaning out itself, and in the lymphatic system of the brain, it takes all this molecular junk out, the molecular junk along with the proteins and those things that are gunking up our brain, and cleans them out. But we don't really, it looks like from the science is that it's not as efficient if we don't sleep enough, right? Or sleep deeply enough. Colonized by our cell phones, all these different kinds of things. We know that sleep is crucial for childhood, so on, and it's crucial for adults. Sleep is when most growth hormones and infection-fighting proteins are released. And not only it affects our memory, as I said, our brain shrinks and different things are difficult for us to learn. This is just a chart that I found, or a figure that I found to look at how the circadian rhythm works. Circadian rhythm isn't just a 24-hour clock. It's, as I'm looking at the research, it says they differ for people. Some people can run for 24 and a half hours, or maybe 23 and a half hours, or whatever it is. So there's a variation there. So not one size fits all. So maybe different for hunter-gatherers versus farmers versus people that live in the urban area and so on. So this is just kind of a, an example. Here we see that, all living beings, different creatures run on a circadian clock. We know that they're endogenously generated, within ourselves, moods, feelings, those kinds of things, but also modulated and can be changed by different things like sunlight, temperature, and so on. If you notice that about yourself, and I wondered about how does that work with Native folks, right? In terms of sun coming up or the temperature of their bedrooms and those kinds of things. Also important in determining the sleeping and the feeding patterns of animals and people. And there are patterns of brainwave activity, hormone production, all these things are linked to this daily cycle. I know that for me, I generally get up right around this time, and my melatonin release probably stops like right around there, pretty early, and I wake right up. The first thing I try to do is if it's sunny out, I try to go out and stand in the sunlight for a while, especially in the when the summertime, fall time, even in the winter. And I didn't realize this until I was looking at the research too, that there are times when we function the best, our coordination and reaction time. Again, like I said, give or take a little time in between this. But if you were having brain surgery, you'd probably want your neurosurgeon to be operating right here rather than at light or 5 o'clock in the morning, right? Because we see this kind of reaction time, depending upon how their circadian clock goes. I don't drink caffeine hardly at all. Drink a little bit today because I have a genetic variant that I'm a very slow metabolizer of caffeine. So if I drink caffeine, it can really screw up my whole day. I'm exploring that to find out why I have that particular genetic variant. So anyway, this kind of shows kind of a general sort of things when you start dimming the lights, and technology use should be avoided or cut down. And they have in the sleep science what they call sleep procrastination, which a lot of people are prone to these days, because this is the time when people start watching Netflix and start watching a lot of the movies and keeping the lights on, right? So we start to disrupt the circadian clock. Getting over to this area, this is where we're talking about the different levels of restorative deep sleep, whether it's the theta or delta levels of sleep. A lot of us kind of remain in maybe alpha levels of sleep, where we're kind of lightly sleeping and wake up very easily. That's kind of like in the REM sleep too as well. So that's what the circadian looks like.
Dr. Albert,
yeah.
I just want to interrupt for a second because it's about 8 minutes to 1. So I know we asked you to be here till 1. I think a lot of people would be interested in staying if they are able to. If they're not, we can send them a link to the rest of the talk, but just keeping in mind the time.
Okay, so what are you asking me? You want me to stop?
So if you want to keep going, we can keep going, but I just wanted to let you know that we only had booked this time until 1 p.m. and so some people might need to leave, but we can always send the link after if you're able to stay a bit longer.
Okay, all right, so let me just sort of move forward with this. It's a lot of stuff here. Okay, just a few more slides, then let me go on to talk about this. Like I mentioned before, the research that's happening today, I'm reading a lot of research about the importance of heat shock proteins in the cells and how they're activated and how they play a role in preventing protein misfolding, right? So when proteins misfold, we know that the diseases of aging show up earlier, but higher levels of heat shock proteins in the cells are a sign of longevity and being healthier. So the research is showing that when people are in very hot environments, if you're sitting in a really hot sauna, 170 degrees for 20 minutes, 5 times a week, then blood samples are going to show you have high levels of heat shock proteins. If you take a cold, ice cold shower for 5 minutes in the morning, same thing happens. Your level of heat shock proteins goes up, which is, again, you're going to see that high levels are a sign of longevity and well-being. We know too that cold, for example, being in the cold, and I push myself because I don't like the cold, but taking cold showers or being outside with no shirt on, in my backyard when it's really cold, until I get to the point I start to shiver. I know that what's happening there is that, when the body gets to that state, we start burning what's called white fat, the stored kind of fat, and producing more brown fat. I call it indigenous fat, right? That's the better kind of more lean, makes us more lean. Fasting, as I said, has, all these really important benefits. And I'll just kind of end with these last couple of slides. So this particular slide here is talking about fasting, and how this particular priest, Paul Lejeune, was among these Indian hunter-gatherers in Canada, 1636. And he says, he's writing in his journal, I saw them in their hardships and labor suffer with cheerfulness. I found myself with them threatened with great suffering. They said to me, we shall be sometimes 2, sometimes 3 days without eating for lack of food. Take courage, Shinini. Let thy soul to be strong to endure suffering and hardship. Keep thyself from being sad, otherwise thou wilt be sick. See how we do not cease to laugh, even though we have little to eat. So I thought that was pretty fascinating, understanding now that we know that these hunter-gatherer folks very likely had the serotonin transporter gene, that they learned how to have this sense of humor when in the very hard things, when they're being tested very much, right? So there's that association. Finally, this is cognitive resilience. Those things that I've talked about, the stresses on your body, like running and like sitting in a hot sauna, any kind of thing that creates a mild bioenergetic stress helps build cognitive resilience, right? And we see that right here in this, what they call the ventral medial prefrontal cortex at the bottom of the the left and right hemisphere of the brain. So from the research that's been done, this is what's been determined, that when people are resiliently coping, like let's say I'm sitting in a cold of ice cold water, or I'm sitting in a very hot sauna, or if I've been fasting for 72 hours for 3 days, this part of my brain is activated, right? If I'm hangry and I'm really suffering and I'm about ready to pass out and die, it's probably I'm not coping with it very well, so there's no activation. What's really cool about this in terms of ancestral living is that I know that when I was in Northern California at Humboldt State University, I had a chance to work in Yurok territory and learn a lot about how the Yurok people put their young people at a very early age through a lot of training and learning how to deal with high levels of stress, swimming out in the ocean open, which is very cold in Northern California, or these young people running at night through the mountains when it's very cold, and where there are grizzly bears and mountain lions up there, but also mountain spirits. And then they had to learn how to deal with that, through songs and prayers, and then talking with elders. And so they were getting this experience. So what we know, finally, last thing is that ventral medial prefrontal cortex, what I call the very mad private first class, right? You can ask me about that. Is that, again, location prefrontal cortex, located in the frontal lobe at the bottom of the cerebral hemispheres. It's implicated in all these things, right? Processing of risk and fear, inhibition of emotional responses and emotional regulation, processing decision-making and self-control, but also something very fascinating too, is involved in the cognitive evaluation of morality. So let me just circle back to the Yuroks very quickly. So these things were all pretty clear that, they were brave, they were courageous, they could take on do the risk and the fear, they could control their emotions. But as I was reading some anthropological papers about these particular practices, that's one of the observations that an anthropologist made, is that people who had gone through these ceremonial hardships, right, rituals, and for a long period of time had become the most generous, compassionate, and moral people in the tribe. So it was very, very ensuring to say, wow, this is what Indigenous people have been doing forever. And it sort of gets us beyond now what Western medicine or health is talking about. So I'm going to just stop there and see if there's any questions.
Okay, so we do have questions. Thank you so much for that talk. That was so interesting. The first question comes from Beverly on Facebook, who's watching on Facebook, and she asks, how does one get started to do these things?
I do this for social workers a lot, and I tell them, I said, it's do your own assessment. yourself. But I tell social workers, if you're working for someone, ask them how many times they danced this week, you know, really seriously. How many times did you go out for a walk and run and get your heart rate up, right? If you can do that. How many times did you sing? Right? How many times did you sing a song or turn on the radio and sing with that, right? And just let it go and enjoy yourself singing. So it's those kinds of things. You know, if you want to start slow with developing, you know, mild bioenergetic stress and losing weight, besides, you know, if you're you know, running or dieting, you know, seriously, get in the cold shower 5 minutes. You know, start very slow. Get in the cold shower to a point where you kind of start to shiver. Then, you know, do that till you work up. There's all these different kinds of things people can do. Sleep, you know, sleep is probably one of the hardest and one of the easiest things to correct. It's hardest because we get in a routine, right? And we get these habits, right, that are kind of, you know, pathways to stay up late or whatever. But to practice sleeping, you know, is one of the most important things, right? Just like the clock was saying, you know, stop your caffeine, start turning down the lights, and when you get tired, go to sleep. Don't procrastinate. When you wake up in the morning, wake up. And the big thing is to do it consistently. Every night, go to bed at 10:30. Every morning, wake up at 5:30, whatever it is, and get up and make yourself do it. And stay with a routine. So do it all the time. So these things are very manageable. When we're back at it again, when the pandemic is over, I say to folks, you know, make sure you're fit enough to do it. But I would say, you know, it's really important to start doing a sauna 4 or 5 times a week, slowly building up with the heat and that sort of thing. These things are all going to be good for you. Fasting, the same thing. I fast every day. Fast every day, and I fast periodically for 72 to 120 hours. You know, 3 to 5 days sometimes. But you know, I start out slow and build up with all of these different kinds of things. All of these things are easy to fit into your schedule, right? They don't cost any money, and they're very manageable too as well. So.
Thank you. I've asked if anyone has a question, you can please leave it in the chat. Oh, here's one. Thank you so much for your amazing talk. I feel inspired to focus more on my wellness. This is from Sarah. What are some ways we can prioritize wellness during long work days?
So I read a really interesting study very recently, and this is something I do. When you're sitting in front of, first of all, get a stand-up, you know, desk if you can get one, or pile some books up so you're standing up. Get used to standing, you know, and getting used to moving. Don't sit. They say sitting is the new smoking, and it is. It's really hard on the back, the body, hard on you know, your joints. It shortens your ligaments and your hips. A lot of back problems. We were not engineered to sit. We sit too much. That's the first thing. Second thing is that if you don't have to be at work, you can be at home what you're doing. So take 2 minutes to jog in place about 3 or 4 times a day, maybe 5 times a day, just to get your heart rate up. You're going to see an interesting study I was looking at said that not only does it raise the level of oxygen, you know, in your brain, but it also improves your memory and begins and helps you, sort of reset, you know. So do that, you know, 4 or 5 times a day. It's really amazing how easy some of these things are to do during a weekday. I say drink a lot of water during the day. Things that are really important. I think we're not getting enough workout if we have a bad diet. I think things as easy as, or as important as drinking green tea is very important. There's something I do. You want to lower your levels of inflammation in the body. So, you know, those are just some things you can do.
I really wrote every single one of those things down and realized I don't do any of them while you shared that, so thank you. Charisma asks, where can we access more of this information?
You know, let's see here. The sleep pattern. You can actually find that. I've actually pulled it off of the internet. When you start looking at circadian rhythms, I would suggest if you want to search, look at circadian rhythms and look at sleep science. There's a lot of good articles. There's really good books written in that area. So there's a lot of stuff being published and written. If you're really interested, I go to PubMed too, and I would look at sleep and look at sleep of hunter-gatherers versus people in urban areas. Those are some of the things that I've been looking at. So.
Dr. Cook says, thank you so much, Michael. I enjoyed your talk and the visuals. Is there any possibility that you might share the circadian slides? So that's the second person who asked that. So
yeah, I can. Why don't I do that? Ruth, or Sarah or Ruth, or I'll send it to you.
Okay, perfect. And if anyone wants that, just DM your email address and we will share that with you. I see Catherine has actually turned on her video. I'm not sure if she wanted to say something here. Dr. Cook?
I just wanted to thank Michael. I thought that was a great, very interesting talk. Really makes you think in ways that that I have not thought before. We've had other talks in the past, and I've been very interested in your approach to some of the approaches to wellness and mindfulness. So thank you very much for sharing this. It was very insightful. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you so much. I had one other question. I'm just wondering where you're going to take your research and practice next, and if graduate students might be able to get involved as well.
Yeah, I mean, I really, it would be wonderful, I think, to do some of these things. I've been thinking about that. In fact, one of the things I was going to do with a colleague down at North Dakota State University and the University of North Dakota was to look at some of the folks, reservation tribes down in North Dakota, and look at some of these areas to see whether or not some of these interventions would actually improve the length of people's telomeres, right? So they could report and say, yeah, I sleep better, whatever. But if we could find another area where we could do another measure and say, let's draw some blood from people, and we'll put you on 6 months of this program, and then find out whether or not you've had any increase in the telomeres. We might look at the gut biome to find out whether or not people eating a certain kind of diet improves the healthy populations of bacteria in the gut, and if there's a correlation with the reduction of inflammation as well as reduction of weight, and maybe even the cessation of things like diabetes or hypertension or those kinds of things. I think those are really easy implementations. They're not very sophisticated, right, interventions, but I think these are things that I've been seeing in the research, where the graduate students could actually carry out some of these kinds of protocols and do actually collect the data, come and bring it back, and maybe have a control group, and then focus on any changes that we're seeing. And that's what we've been calling molecular decolonization, right? Actually decolonizing at that level there, right? Because we know that from those molecular cellular areas that if we're seeing, for example, if we have this would be even easier if we had a group of folks, control group of people, another group of people that were, sitting in a hot sauna so many days a week for so many weeks, be easy enough for folks, to draw some blood samples to look at the level of heat shock proteins in rising in the blood of people, which, then we'd find out, later students could even do bone measurements to find out if there's, and muscle measurements, all those kinds of things. So again, these interventions, are very simple and can yield a lot of really great data, I think. So.
Okay, so thank you so much. I don't see any more questions, and it is 10 after 1. So I just want to thank you very much again for your talk today. And we will share the links with those who had to leave right at 1, just so they can catch the end and the answers to those questions. In-person times, we would normally have thanks this time, but for being in online times, we will put that in the mail for you. The Indigenous Scholars Speaker Series will return in the winter term with 3 more talks. We have Dr. Frank Deere from the Faculty of Education. He'll be here on Thursday, January 28th. Dr. Sarah Goulet from the Max Rady College of Medicine and the Rady Faculty of Health Science will be here Thursday, February 25th. And Dr. Mylène Gamache from the Departments of Native Studies and Women's and Gender Studies in the Faculty of Arts will be here on Thursday, March 25th. So mark those dates in your calendars, and all of the talks will start at noon. And thank you so much again, Dr. Yellowbird. It was great to finally get to hear you speak. I've heard you on panels, but this is great to hear you present on your research. So thank you, miigwech.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, everyone.